Hello, and welcome to the class instructions for the Black Death simulation video. This video can be played in a class in order to help guide your students through how to play the game. The first thing that you'll want to do is to form groups. Your groups should consist of 2 to 4 students, ideally 4. You would next want to assign roles. Your group will be playing a family trying to survive the Black Death. Each person will play a particular individual or individuals. When you make a decision, try and think about how the person you're playing would act. So for example, Fotina is a daughter and older sister. How might she treat her parents? How might she treat her younger brother? In addition, you'll notice also that each person has quirks. For example, Fotina loves animals and frequently takes care of sick ones. The instructors should please hand out the roles shortly. If you're in a group of 4, each person would play 1 role. If you're in a group of 3, one person would play 2 roles and everyone else would play 1. And if you're in a group of 2, each person plays 2 roles. The main thing is that each group should make sure to have all 4 of the family cards. And as noted before, please familiarize yourself with your card. Think about who your person is and try and act as the way you think they would act. In this game, you will also have some counters. These are things like money on the left. That's a soldo. That's the kind of coin they used in 14th century Italy. And on the right is a piece of bread representing food. Another kind of card you will have in addition to your character card are event cards. Each week of game time, you will draw a card randomly from a deck. You can draw from the top. You can have someone fan out the cards and draw. As long as it's random, then it's fine however you draw. Some of these cards are good. For example, Dolce has a card here that says a neighbor's son is courting a girl and buys a lot of roses from Dolce. Add 3 soldo to the lockbox. I'll explain more about how to do that later. Another card says Dolce got distracted by her roses and does not work enough in the garden. Remove 2 food from the pantry. Another thing you will have are dice. I would recommend not to hand out the dice until needed, because of course, once people have dice, they like to roll them. It's just part of human nature. But there's a thing historians call historical contingency. Regular people tend to just call this luck. Sometimes you will make a decision in this game, and you'll roll dice to see if things turned out well, or if they didn't turn out well. As a general rule, the higher the number you roll, the better. So for example, a 20 is better than a 14, a 14 is better than a 6. But in this game, you want to roll high. Now it's time to set up the board. In order to set up the board, you first get the board. Those need to be handed out. And then you would place 2 food counters in the pantry. That's on the upper right. Please notice you can never have more than 10 food there. Place 2 soldo. Those are the coins on the lockbox in the upper left. And then at the bottom, you can see several numbers. Please put a piece of bread over the 17. That's how much food your family needs per week, unless your teacher tells you differently. They may adjust it to make the game harder or easier. Family earnings per week, that's how much you make, right? Your family, because some of you work in the garden, makes 4 food a week, so please put a food marker over that. And you make 25 soldo. Dado is a blacksmith, and his family also does different things to help make money. So you make 25 coins each week. Please use the counters to mark those numbers so you'll be able to remember them. Now in this game, each turn is 1 week. I will give the instructions, but please note for our instructors, you would probably want to pause after I give each bullet point to make sure that your students are able to keep up. So I will go through these at a pretty normal pace, so you'll want to pause as necessary. So for the first week, add food and soldo to the lockbox and pantry as described in the family earnings per week section on the board. Draw a card and follow its instructions. Be sure to add or take away food or soldo if an event card requires it. Buy enough food until you have enough as required by the food needed per week section on the board. 1 soldo buys 1 food. Be sure to remove the soldo counters. Feed everyone by removing food counters from the pantry. Up to 10 food can be stored, so if you want, you can buy more food than you need. If you do that, remove the soda counters and add the food counters. That brings us to our second week. Dado's friend Mordecai Ben Simon comes for a visit. He is a merchant who sometimes buys things from Dado to sell. Remember, Dado is a blacksmith. Now, one thing I do want to note that is different about Mordecai is that he is Jewish. You can tell by his name. Mordecai Ben Simon means Mordecai, son of Simon. Most people in 14th century Italy would, of course, been Catholic, but there was a Jewish minority in Italy and in other European countries. Mordecai tells you that he has heard rumors of a terrible disease ravaging faraway towns. Add food and soda to the lockbox and pantry as described in the family earnings per week section on the board. Draw a card and follow its instructions. Be sure to add or take away food or soda if an event card requires it. Buy enough food until you have enough as required by the food needed per week section on the board. One soldo buys one food. Be sure to remove the soldo counters. Feed everyone by removing food counters from the pantry. Feed everyone by removing food counters from the pantry. Up to 10 food can be stored, so if you want, you can buy more food than you need. If you do that, remove the soda counters and add the food counters. Your friend Mordecai Ben Simon went to run some errands as he prepared to leave. Suddenly you hear a commotion outside and look out the window to see what is happening. You see Mordecai being chased by an angry mob. He jumps over the wall around your house and pounds on your back door. What do you do? Do you let him in and hide him? Do you ignore him? Or do you open the door and grab him and turn him over to the angry mob? Please discuss with your group and don't go to the next slide until you have made a decision. If you let Mordecai in your house, one family member rolls a d20. You need to get at least a 15 in order to have something good happen. 14 or under, something bad will happen. If you have a Divine Providence card, it can be used to re-roll this number. If the score is at least a 15, you successfully hide Mordecai and gain a Divine Providence card. In addition, as you help Mordecai escape the town later on, he gives the family 5 soldo. If you fail, the angry mob breaks in, takes Mordecai and kills him, and steals half your food and soldo, rounded up. But the family gains a Divine Providence card. If you do nothing, the angry mob seizes Mordecai and kills him. If you turn Mordecai over to the family, if you turn Mordecai over, the family receives 5 soldo from the leaders of the mob, which then kills him. So I need to now explain a little bit about what happened here. People didn't quite understand how the plague spread. Unfortunately, some people in Europe blame Jewish people for the plague. This is in part because they were a distrusted minority whose members are often forced into unpopular professions at the time. So, for example, if we go back a little bit and we look at this image, this is presenting Jewish people as moneylenders, as bankers. Typically, in many European countries, Jewish people were not allowed to own land, and so they might have to go into a profession like being a merchant, which is what Mordecai Ben Simon was, or they might go into money lending. And unfortunately, people who lend money out often become unpopular with the people who owe them money. And of course, if you could get rid of the people who you owed money to, you wouldn't have to pay them back, right? And of course, people who loan money are generally, unfortunately, not popular, even if they are performing a service. So unfortunately, Jewish people were forced into unpopular professions like money lending. They were also often forced to wear special clothing so they would be easy to identify. So it would be easy then to find this unpopular minority if you were looking for someone to blame for the plague. They then might be forced into they then might be tortured into confessing, and then that was used as evidence. For instance, sometimes people claimed that the Jewish people were poisoning wells, that they would put poison in a well where people would get water, and that was what was causing the plague. Then someone would find one of these Jewish people, which wouldn't be hard because they might be wearing special clothing, and then torture them to force them to confess that they in fact had poisoned the well, and then that was used as evidence in order to go after other Jewish people. Unfortunately, this led to massacres. For example, the image on the right is depicting an actual event that occurred in Germany where several hundred Jewish people were burned to death. Now, the Pope and other Catholic leaders criticized this, said that this was wrong to do. One thing that was pointed out by these leaders was that Jewish people were also dying of the plague in an equal number as Christians. So it didn't make sense, right? If Jewish people were poisoning wells, they would have known not to drink from those wells. Unfortunately, this did not work, and they were unable in many cases to stop these unfortunate attacks on Jewish people, who often were blamed unfairly for the plague. That then brings us to our next turn. So that brings us to week 3. So I need to explain a little bit about how people understood disease during this time period. So while on one side, there were people who thought that the plague was caused by poison, there were others who understood that there was some kind of contagion. They understood that if you were around sick people, you could get sick. Now, we understand things like bacteria and viruses today. They didn't understand those things. So, but they did understand that people could get sick by being in contact with other people who were sick. So they understood kind of the mechanism. They just didn't understand what caused it, right? They understood ideas of being around sick people can make you sick. They just didn't understand why. And so one thing that was done in Italy was they developed something called a lazaretto. Now, that idea came into other countries. That picture on the right is a picture of a lazaretto from Pennsylvania in the United States that was built in the 19th century. But the idea of a lazaretto was if someone was bringing supplies or things to trade by boat into your town in Italy, they would have to stay on an island for 40 days before they were allowed to come onto the mainland. And the idea was to isolate them, right? So that if there was a ship coming in and there were problems with disease, they would have to come park their ship on the island and stay there for 40 days. And then after that, they could go on onto the mainland to sell their goods. So the idea was that they did understand something like quarantine. Now, you may say, why 40 days? Well, that is a biblical number meaning wholeness or completeness. For example, Jesus fasted for 40 days in the desert. Likewise, Moses spent 40 years wandering in the desert. And it's called a lazaretto after Lazarus, who Christians believe Jesus raised from the dead. Remember, this is very much a Catholic culture that we're looking at. And the idea here is that, in a sense, you're kind of dead when you go on the island because it's assumed that you're maybe sick. You got to stay there for 40 days. But then like Lazarus, and so the island's kind of like a tomb. And after you leave, it's like you're Lazarus being resurrected, or I should rather say raised from the dead from that tomb. So it's interesting because in this time period, we see on one side, people are understanding some scientific things. They understand the concept of contagion. They understand the concept of quarantine. They know that if they keep you in a place and you don't show signs of disease for a certain amount of time, you don't have that disease. But they also understand it through a religious lens, right? They name the lazarettos after Jesus and Lazarus. And of course, they talk about this 40 days that you have to spend there. It's a reference to the Bible. So we're now week 3, and there are rumors that the strange disease is ravaging a nearby town. This leads to the establishment of lazarettos. Please add food and soldo to the lockbox and pantry as described in the family earnings per week section of the board. Draw a card and follow its instructions. Be sure to add or take away food or soldo if an event card requires it. Buy enough food until you have enough as required by the food needed per week. Please notice though now it costs 2 soldo to buy 1 food owing to a limited supply and hoarding. Right? People are afraid that a disease is coming. They're worried that it might be difficult to get food. Of course, the lazarettos, because they're putting people in quarantine, as necessary as that makes it harder to get food. So please note that it now costs 2 soldo to buy 1 food. Please, when you buy food, be sure to remove the soldo counters. Feed everyone by removing food counters from the pantry. Up to 10 food can be stored, so if you want, you can buy more food than you need. If you do that, remove the soldo counters and add the food counters. If you do not have enough food, draw a starvation card for each missing food. The person whose name is on the starvation card should keep that card. They can get rid of that card if they eat an extra food another week. This can only be done after everyone has already eaten their required food for that week. So if you have a starvation card this week, you need forward food, and it says how much food you need on your card, your family card. Next week, you could eat 5 food, provided everyone else has eaten enough, and get rid of that starvation card. Those will come into play later. Week 4, cases of the Black Death begin to appear in your town. Add food and soldo to the lockbox and pantry as described in the family earnings per week section on the board. Draw a card and follow its instructions. Be sure to add or take away food or soldo if an event card requires it. Buy enough food until you have enough as required by the food needed per week. 3 soldo buys 1 food owing to a limited supply and hoarding. Be sure to remove the soldo counter, so please note it now costs 3 soldo to buy 1 food. Feed everyone by removing food counters from the pantry. Up to 10 food can be stored, so if you want, you can buy more food than you need. If you do that, remove the soldo counters and add the food counters. If you do not have enough food, draw a starvation card for each missing food. The person whose name is on the starvation card should keep that card. They can get rid of that card if they eat an extra food in another week. This can only be done after everyone has already eaten their required food for that week. At this point, I would encourage instructors to play the What Was the Black Death video. If you look this up on YouTube or have prepared the link ahead of time, please find the video and start at 2:21 and discuss with your class the following questions. What were the symptoms like? Why was it difficult to prevent an epidemic? What was the mortality rate of pneumonic versus septicemic plague? What made people particularly vulnerable to the plague? And please do keep in mind as you play in this game that you are playing a person who lived through this and has learned, because of people coming down with this in your town, what this actually looks like. That brings us to week 5. Quarantine has become stricter. Add food and soldo to the lockbox and pantry as described in the family earnings per week section on the board. Draw a card and follow its instructions. Be sure to add or take away food or soldo if an event card requires it. Buy enough food until you have enough as required by the food needed per week. 4 soldo buys 1 food owing to a limited supply and hoarding. Be sure to remove the soldo counters. Feed everyone by removing food counters from the pantry. Food can be stored, so if you want, you can buy more food than you need. If you do that, remove the soldo counters and add the food counters. If you do not have enough food, draw a starvation card for each missing food. The person whose name is on the starvation card should keep that card. They can get rid of that card if they eat an extra food in another week. This can only be done after everyone has already eaten their required food for that week. I have bad news. Someone has become infected by the Black Death. Everyone should now roll a health check. Each one of you should roll d20 and subtract the number of starvation cards you have. For instance, if you roll 14 and have 3 starvation cards, your modified roll would be an 11, because 14 minus 3 equals 11. A Divine Providence card cannot be used to re-roll. And I will be having a pause between each bullet point, but instructors, you might want to pause the video in order to make sure that students have enough time to complete the instructions. Whoever has the lowest number has fallen ill. right? Whoever has the lowest number has fallen ill. If the lowest two people tie with the lowest number, have those two people roll again. Now that you know who is sick, the family must decide what to do with that person. Specifically, the family must decide whether to place that person in a separate room without food and water, place that person in the separate room and choose a family member to bring food and water to the sick person. It's important that you clearly identify which family member is going to be the one bringing them food and water. Or you can place that person in the separate room and choose a family member to bring food and water, and that person will also stay and take care of them. If the family cannot come to a consensus, as patriarch, Dado makes the final decision. So now we have to determine, does the sixth person survive? The sixth person rolls a d20 and subtracts the number of starvation cards they have. Please remember that total. So for example, if you rolled a 14 and you have 3 starvation cards, you would have an 11. If you're put in a separate room alone without food and water, subtract 10 from your total. If you have a negative number, just consider it a 0. So for example, if you had an 11, that would now be a 1. If you were put in a separate room alone, but someone brought you food and water, subtract 5 from the total. So that 11 would now be a 6. If you're brought food and water and someone takes care of you, add 3 to the total. So in that case, your 11 would be a 14. If you had at least a 14 or more, you survived. Congratulations. If you had less than 14, you die. However, you can use a Divine Providence card to re-roll. Please make sure to modify your roll as stated above. And if you do die, don't worry, the game's not over for you. Your instructor has a special card for you. Now, as mentioned previously, people understood contagion. They understood that being around sick people can make you sick. And so the question we now have is, did any other family members catch the plague? So anyone who was not sick, anyone who did not have the Black Death, rolls a d20 and subtracts the number of starvation cards they have. Remember that total. If you brought the sick person food and water, but did not stay with the sick family member, subtract 5 from your total. So let's say you rolled a 14 and you had 3 starvation cards giving you 11, and you brought food and water, and it's only the individual who did that. 11 minus 5 would give you a 6. If you brought food and water and stayed with your sixth family member, subtract 10 from your total. As you can see, that pretty much guarantees that you might that pretty much guarantees that you will get sick, right? If you're around a person that much who had the plague, you're probably going to get it. If you had a total of 14 or more, you stayed healthy. A Divine Providence card can be used to re-roll. Make sure to modify your roll as stated above. Please raise your hand if you became ill. Now we have to determine, did those people who fell ill survive? If you became ill, roll a d20 and subtract the number of starvation cards you have. If you had at least a 14 or more, you survived. If you had less than 14, you die. A Divine Providence card can be used to re-roll. I should also note, if someone died in your family previously, they might have something that they want to do now. So who died? Please raise your hand. And please raise your hand now if you survived. So that concludes the game part of this activity. Now the instructor will guide you in a reflection and discussion about what you learned from the Black Death simulation.